You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today I am joined again by Jenny McGrath. Jenny, it's good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks for having me back.
Jenny is on the show today to talk about her passion, which is how story intersects with bodies. And she has a digital course, a video course, it has lots of components to it that she's going to talk about. But let's start with a little bit about your story. Like, how did you personally become so interested in the relationship between your physical body and the story of your life?
I think it's really been a lifelong journey for me. And I think I've seen that the more I've learned about my own body and my own story. And so from a really young age, I had a lot of symptoms of what I now know of as trauma symptoms. I remember often asking, what does it mean when you feel like you're dreaming? And I just had this sense often that I wasn't real or the world wasn't real. And by the time I was 9, I was having to work with chiropractors and physical therapists because of really severe lower back pain due to disconnection with my pelvis and my pelvic floor muscles. And I didn't know why at the time. I can now see all of the ways in which my body was speaking to me. And then when I was 15, I started having chronic hip pain, which I had for the next 10 plus years of my life. So there was all of these things that I was experiencing and I didn't have language for. And then when I was in graduate school and I first learned about dissociation or the ways in which trauma is stored in our body, I just would cry because I was like, this makes so much make sense. And so I was both really passionate about what I was learning, and it was so healing for me. And I was still experiencing a really big disconnect in the psychology world where we might talk about bodies and the importance of bodies, but there still wasn't a lot of engagement of bodies. And so while I was in grad school, me and 3 other women that were part of my cohort would meet with one of my friends, Sherry, who owns a local dance studio. And we would just meet for like 2 hours once a week and just be like, what happens when we do this with our bodies? Or what happens when we do this? And we learned some things that really helped, and we learned some things that really didn't help. And it became this kind of trial and error. And it was also a point where I would get in there pretty manic and I would be like, I've got so much energy. I just can't wait to move. And for the first year, most of the time, I would just fall asleep. And I would literally, that was like my movement therapy, was just sleeping on the ground for 2 hours because my body was so exhausted. And I didn't know at the time that I was just combating that with staying busy and pushing forward. And so it was really a long process of learning what my body was saying and learning why it was really scary to listen to what my body was saying. I think, the more I started to validate the symptoms I had, the physical memories I had, it brought up a lot. It brought up a lot of challenges. And so I think while my body was speaking to me about these things for so long, it was also really kind to kind of protect me from knowing too much too soon. And so I often say that I'm the biggest learner of what I'm teaching, that I found that it's difficult and challenging to engage the body, but it's also so freeing and something that I just am really, as you said, passionate about getting to share with other people and reintroduce them to their bodies and let them start to trust the wisdom of their body and what their body is speaking.
So say more about this whole notion of like your body speaking to you, because you don't mean that metaphorically.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
So say more, like give some examples of how might sensation in my body be trying to tell me something of value.
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, for me, I had this experience for a really long time of what I would now call dissociation, where I actually experienced a lack of sensation. It was hard for me to ever feel my body. I noticed that the only time I really actually felt in my body was when I was in really dangerous or life threatening situations. And I would almost have this opposite experience where I would feel really calm and really peaceful because it was like my body finally, the outside was finally matching what I was feeling on the inside. And so I think that, often our symptoms of anxiety or what can feel like depression or just these bouts of emotions, they can often be labeled as symptoms, but there's not often a lot of questions about why we have the symptoms. And I like to use
Mhm.
the example, it's like if you've ever touched a hot stove and you know what that feels like in your body, if you ever come close to accidentally touching those red coils again, your arm is going to react before you even have time to think about it. And so that's what happens emotionally, that's what happens relationally. And I think that's why it's so important to understand, we have these stress response cycles that we go through of fight or flight or freeze or fawn. And we might get triggered by our spouse, we might get triggered by the person on the street, and our body registers that just like it would those hot coils, but we might not understand why immediately we're screaming or we're just shutting down and crying and we need to just dissociate for days. And so starting to understand the way the body speaks in what I'd call activation or a lack of
Mhm.
activation, and really understanding when we are feeling too much or when we're feeling nothing, and getting to stay curious where those physiological responses or emotions might be coming from.
Let me be like a devil's advocate for a minute and say, isn't trauma all in my head? I mean, why should I care about the parts of me from my neck down when it comes to healing from trauma?
Mhm. I would say that you're not totally off in that trauma does exist in our head. And I think the issue is that we have created a severing of our head from the rest of our body. And so we might have thoughts of trauma, we might have memories of trauma in our brain, and we have different ways of remembering. So we might have explicit trauma where we can picture ourselves in the event. But we also have implicit memory where we might feel the same sensations, we might feel the same pain, we might feel the same energetic charge that we did in the event. But sometimes we might not even have cognitive memory of the experiences that happened because our body kind of shuts down our prefrontal cortex and our thinking brain because we need our oldest part of ourselves, our nervous system, to take over for us. Our brain is a little bit slower to process. So by the time my brain says red coils mean hot stove, so that's going to hurt if I touch it, I'm already burning my hand. But it's my nervous system and my survival response that moves my hand before it's even in my brain.
One of the things that really helped me here was when I learned. So you talk a lot about the vagus nerve. I'll ask you about it in a minute.
Yeah.
But the vagus nerve is this big, wandering, meandering cranial nerve that goes down deep into all the parts of our body. And 80% of the fibers of the vagus nerve are afferent, which means that they go from the body, from below the neck,
Right.
into the brain. In other words, our brains are getting tons of information from our viscera, from our gut, from our chest, from our pelvis, from our body. And that data is informing how we experience the world. And so you are so, in my mind, one of the reasons you're so passionate about the body, and I'm becoming increasingly passionate about it when it comes to healing from trauma, is because we have this thing called a vagus nerve, and the science has shown us that our bodies influence our brains far more than we ever thought.
Yep. Yep.
Pat Ogden, who is, I know you familiar, she wrote a great book called Trauma in the Body, which really introduced me to the work that you do, Jenny. And she says this, she says that therapy needs to help clients develop a deep curiosity about their internal bodily experience. And I want to ask you to start talking about your course now, the Embodied Story course, because that's one of the things your course does, is it helps us become curious about what's happening below our necks. Why is that important? And start kind of introducing us to this course that you've developed.
Yeah, absolutely. As you were sharing about the vagus nerve, I was reminded of Jonathan Haidt describes our body and our brain sort of as an elephant with a rider. And our frontal cortex is like this little rider, and the rest of our body, our vagus nerve, our limbic system is like this elephant. And most often we convince ourselves that we make logical decisions when actually we make emotional decisions that we create logic to describe. And so I think letting ourselves continue to have kindness and understanding for the emotions underneath the decisions that we make enables us to not need to stigmatize the decisions that we make. And so I've intentionally crammed a lot of information into the course. It's roughly 10 years of my research, of my professional experience, of clinical practice, of professional development, because I think that this information is so vital and so necessary. And I think, especially in the climate politically and ecologically that we're living right now, I think our bodies are speaking very loudly through the trauma that we've been experiencing collectively in this last 18 months. And so my hope is that it will be an introduction or a reintroduction for folks into their body and into validating the emotions and the responses that are there. And I think it also is important to name, because so much of our experience comes from our vagus nerve, we can't think ourselves into a state of safety. And so this work becomes extra complex when we are dealing with oppressed bodies, when we're dealing with Black or brown bodies or LGBTQ plus bodies who have very real reasons that their nervous system would tell them they're not safe. And so one of the reasons that I created this course was that I became a little disenchanted with story work being so individualized and what it means to heal our individual story. Because as a white, straight, cis, able-bodied woman, I'm also entangled in a lot of stories where my ancestors and my own body perpetuate systems of harm. And so while I think it's so important to hold stories where we've been victims, I think it's also to hold stories of our shadow, of where we've become complicit, where we've caused harm, to really recognize that our healing is done together. I really love Lila Watson. She's an Indigenous Australian woman, says, if you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because you know your liberation is bound up in mine, let us work together. And so that's really the ethos of my course is I understand that my healing is so interwoven and entangled with the healing of all bodies, that when we have systems of oppression and harm, we can't find true healing from individual trauma when we're continuing to perpetuate these systems.
So take us through just briefly, like the modules of this course, and maybe say a little bit about each one.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, there's a lot of moving parts to the course. And part of that is that, I think we learn differently by hearing things in different ways. And so I've intentionally kind of created a bit of repetition and talking about the same information from different angles. And so I have teaching modules where it's me talking about our vagus nerve, our psoas muscle, our breath, how trauma gets stored in our individual and collective bodies, how movement and connecting to our bodies can bring us out of that trauma, and the power of story. And so we kind of look at that from a head level. And I intentionally have lots of links to TED Talks or YouTube videos or articles to continue kind of gleaning these different ideas of interacting with our body. And then I have exercises, both audio that you can just listen to and move or write or do whatever feels good in your body. And then I also have audio mixed with video. So there's exercises where I'm doing the exercise. And so you can kind of feel someone doing that with you together. And so all of those different themes also have a PDF workbook that goes into further information about the vagus nerve and the psoas muscle and these different places we hold trauma. And it also has a lot of thought prompts for people to journal and to write and to process what's coming up for them emotionally and what's coming up for them from the information that they're learning. So that's all of the package stuff. And then I also have 4 live Zoom calls that I do as part of the course. And those are completely optional. They're recorded. So some people choose to just watch them after the fact, and you can register for the course whenever you want. And then some people choose to show up and participate because we do have question and answer and group discussion time as well as part of those 4 calls.
So you mentioned a word that some people might be hearing for the first time, and that's psoas, the psoas muscle. It's very, very related to trauma. Tell us where is this thing, and why are you including it as a module in your Embodied Story course?
Yeah, absolutely. The psoas muscle is my favorite muscle, if I could pick one in the body. So it connects to our lumbar spine, our lower back, just below our back set of our ribs. And then it moves down through our belly and it moves through our hips and it connects and innervates through a lot of our vital organs in our belly. And then it moves through each of our hip sockets and connects to the top of our thigh bone, our femur bone. And it's the only muscle we have that connects our upper body and our lower body. So it's known as our fight-flight muscle because it's unconsciously tightens anytime we're in sympathetic activation. It's what we need to run, to kick, to curl into the fetal position. And so if we live in a state of chronic stress or trauma, we can develop a brittle or a fatigued psoas. And another reason it's so important is that it connects with fascia, with connective tissue to our diaphragm, which is our primary muscle for breathing. And our breath really determines whether we're going to be in a state of rest or a state of stress. And so most of what I've learned from the psoas muscle comes from the work of Liz Cook, who's dedicated her entire career studying this muscle. And there's just so much richness to it.
As you're talking, one of the things I'm mindful of is trauma expert Bessel van der Kolk talks about how recovering from trauma is about feeling safe in your own body. He contrasts it with the notion some people have that it's about feeling safe with other people. And that's part of it. But he's like, no. Trauma is about feeling safe with yourself, in your own body. And some of the exercises in your course are designed to help people feel a sense of rest or safety, in the moment that they're doing the exercise in that particular day. And that's really valuable when it comes to trauma recovery. Why is that, Jenny? Why did you include those exercises?
Yeah, I really like the idea that trauma isn't about an event. It's not about something that happens to us. It's about the physiological state of being overwhelmed. And we become traumatized when we aren't able to enact our survival responses of fighting or fleeing or running to safety. And so our body, and this goes back to the question of, is trauma really in my body? Is that we get stuck in a state of fight or flight or freeze where our mind might know that we're not stuck in a traumatic experience, but our heart rate, our breath, our psoas muscle is all saying a different story. And so it really takes us getting into the body and letting the body know, I am safe. I can settle. In this moment, I can trust the ground beneath my feet. That it really lets us move into that parasympathetic rest and digest state that our bodies are wired to spend most of their time in. Sympathetic activation is meant to be a short spurt. But when we don't know that we're out of trauma, then we end up continually being in a state of sympathetic or freeze activation.
This course also has two tiers to it. Why don't you just kind of briefly just explain these two options to people?
Yeah. So tier one includes everything that we've talked about already today. And so does tier two. But tier two is sort of for people that want to engage the material more in a group setting. So they go through the course material with a small group and with me on Zoom over 12 weeks. And so we have another tier two coming up, and applications for that are due on September 12th. But tier one, people can sign up for anytime they want to.
And this is your second year doing it. Like you've done the course once through last year. So what was your favorite part of doing the course the first go around?
Yeah, I think what I've loved and the reason that I'm kind of excited to do, especially the Zoom calls again, is the community that's formed around this material, that it's really individuals who are coming together with the hope of healing their individual and collective story, who are wanting to work through the entanglements of white supremacy and heteronormative structures, and where our stories collide, where they parallel, where they intersect. And so it's just been such a rich experience to get to hear from bodies that don't live like mine, that don't love like mine, that don't look like mine, and that we get to have a wholer, clearer picture of what flourishing and healing get to look like collectively.
How much does it cost? I know there's two different, so explain the cost for each tier.
Tier one is typically $400, and you get lifetime access to an online portal that has 9 teaching videos. Like we described, we talk about collective trauma, individual trauma, the nervous system, the breath, the psoas muscle. We go over movement and somatic forms of healing, and then talk about the value of story work in healing. And then there's over 3 hours worth of those teachings. There's also audio meditations and exercises for you to do, and 7 video exercises for you to do to all help you grow in a felt sense of your story from the inside out. And all of that you have a lifetime access to. You also have access to all of the Zoom calls, both last year. They're all recorded and already on there. And then you have access to come or to watch the recording of the next round that will be happening in September. And then tier two includes, again, all of that plus 12 weeks of pretty intentional, intense engagement with me and others going through the course. And that is $1,200. I wanted to gift your community and your people a discount of $50. So if people register through your website, they can purchase tier one for $350. And then if they do decide to do tier two, they'll still get that $50 discount as well.
If you want to get $50 off the course, just go to my website and click on offerings, and then it'll say Jenny McGrath's Embodied Story course, and you can sign up there. You'll get $50 off. And so people who, this is my sense is that this is for people who are wanting to explore how their bodies have held their story, and maybe for people who, kind of like you when you were younger, are a little disconnected from their body,
Mhm.
and may not have very much sense of what they sense in their gut or their chest or their shoulders. So what about people, Jenny, like that, who don't feel very connected to their body? Can they do this, or is this going to be overwhelming to them, or what?
Yeah, that's a great question. I highly recommend that people do the course in conjunction with therapy or with a really safe community that they can talk about what's coming up for them. Because anytime we intentionally engage our body, we might be really surprised by sensations, by memories, by things that come up. And so I think it's really important to have a space that you can receive care for that. And I would say, if that is true, that you have a hard time connecting to your body, you're in really good company. Because I think most of the folks that have kind of gone through the course are people who are doing the course because they want to have a better relationship with their body. It tends to be, the course is really open to folks of all religious or spiritual or non-religious or non-spiritual practices. And because of who I am and because of my background, it tends to primarily be folks who are processing through even the harm of fundamental Christianity or purity culture, and maybe the trauma of being told their whole life their sexuality is bad, or all of the different ways in which we're entangled with this message of how hard or how scary it is to be in our body. And so it's just been such a beautiful, again, community of people getting to show up for one another and say, yeah, me too. Throughout our Zoom calls, there's so many times people are chatting like, yep, I feel that too, or yep, that makes sense. And just to know that we're not alone in that there's actually a reason that we feel or don't feel the way that we feel or don't feel, I think can be a really empowering thing.
How important, Jenny, would you say in your kind of your growth, your healing, how important has your awareness of and kind of working with your body been in that endeavor of healing?
Mm-hmm.
Like, scale of 1 to 10, how important is that part?
15. Yeah, I think it's been so essential, and I think it's an ongoing work. I love, one of my participants said in our Zoom call, we were talking about the psoas and the importance of constructive rest, and she's like, okay, yeah, so I like brush my teeth. I just need to like brush my psoas, like that just becomes a part of my life. And just the ways in which we can integrate these ways of tending to our body, because I think healing is a lifelong process, and it's similar to how we might care for an animal or someone we love, that it's really starting to live that way from the inside out. And I don't think we can do that from just our heads and just a cognitive space.
Jenny, thank you for coming on the podcast today and explaining these things. Is there any parting words, or have we covered it all?
I would just say our next round of the 4 Zoom calls starts on September 16th. People can register for the course and join after that. But if someone is like, I really want to try to be there for all of the Zoom calls, then they can just register before that time.
So tier 1 is $400. You get $50 off if you go to my website and click on offerings and then the Embodied Story course. If you are wanting to, I'd say the 2 key words are become more curious about the sensations in your body and begin to tend to or respond to, care for the information that's coming up from your body. You might want to check out this course. Jenny, it's good to be with you.
Good to be with you. Thank you so much.